So when I was asked by my client to paint the entire German starter set for Conflict 47, he asked me if I was able to paint camouflage on the rank and file troops because he wanted them to stand out more than the standard Germans. He also wanted to be a bit edgier, but I shot that down. So it was initially a daunting task, since it was something that I had never done before, but I still gave it my all. So initially I did two things. The first was I found references for German camouflage during the Second World War, and the second is that I gave all the models a zenithal highlight, not to do any wizardry this time, but also as a way to see the details. And listen, I know it did spray weird because it was the only time I could, and yeah, the white paint wasn't working. And that I didn't get the mold lines because I was waiting for a better hobby knife because it was dull. So listen, before you go type in the comments, oh no, the mold lines, listen, I didn't have a choice on that one. I wanted to get these done too. Also, Warlord miniatures have the perfect mix of detail where it has the details like suspenders and the canteens, but they're also not drawing too much away from the figure itself. The proportions are just right, and I really do think that it fits the feel of the game as well, because it's supposed to be a bit more arcadey and a bit more out there, and not like some super intricate and detailed game. And you're not dealing with other various aspects like cold, hunger, and stuff like that. It's supposed to be an arcade experience and not something that weighs on the soul. The same could be applied to the miniatures as well. We can accept that the Germans are the default villains of the setting and are probably not supposed to be the heroes. They're protagonists in their own story. And the people who are playing the Germans will be the resident punching bag, probably. Well, this has been a generally accepted thing for historical war games since, forever. But due to the expansion of people who are now interested in the hobby and expect a finer divide between heroes and villains, but, history is complicated like that. And not every... Listen, I'm not going to be political in this, but history is complicated. The other thing is that this is not strictly set in World War II, which happened in our timeline. Rather, it's one of the nice things about Conflict 47, is that there are several fantastic elements, like Wunderwaffe that actually worked, powered by the mysterious rift energy. Ironically, the most normal thing about all of these guys is the fact that they're rank and file troops and they don't have exotic weaponry at all. So not even in the 1949 segment of Wolfenstein The New Order, whenever BJ is storming Normandy, and it's very ramshackled for the Germans. It's not the sleek 60s version of stuff. It's it's a lot bulkier and all that. Anyways, so these are just regular line, they're regular guys just trying to survive against all odds, and probably are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Really, this is also an interesting way to frame a narrative for the paint job. See, this is a simple trick that for you to be motivated for painting the entire figure, and also when you start to lose motivation as well. It's my reason for not all the colors being entirely accurate to what they would have been if this were the attempt to replicate the historical reality of the situation, or to be as close to the historical reality as possible. Instead, these German troops have been out in the field for months, if not years, without proper resupply, and instead rely on supplies scavenged off of dead comrades, enemy soldiers, or warehouses that have been mostly untouched but forgotten by the war, but has still endured some type of wear and tear due to the exposure. And remember that though there was the discovery of rift energy, it might have actually motivated the Germans to shift their focus and resources from the regular troops to their undead or mechanized divisions in order to simply overwhelm the enemy. In the actual Second World War, during the closing months of the Western Front, as the Allies started to really close in on the Germans, the German armed forces did become desperate enough, after getting cut off and run back to their own borders by both sides collapsing in, that basically had them fielding just about everything and arming anyone that they could that could hold a rifle. What I'm trying to get at is that these guys, at the best of current times, are in a precarious position, and the moment we find them in is pretty intense, and the moment we find them in is one of pretty intense desperation. The troops' non-commissioned officers are probably the only ones who really care about them. The higher-ups in Berlin all have their various pet projects, are all trying to position themselves as the next in line, while all the while ignoring the troops that were either drafted to fight or enlisted on a false promise. However, this does not make these Germans really good in any objective sense of the word. While they might be maltreated and used as cannon fodder, the war they wage is still for the Third Reich, a regime that has already committed crimes against humanity and probably continues to follow orders despite all the badness done and committed by the regime itself. Something that is difficult, especially when talking about events that have a general black and white perspective, at least if we're talking about the US and Britain compared to the Soviet Union and the struggle to defeat Germany. Yes, I said that, we're not going to talk about the more intricate details, but what I really meant is that, listen, there are, even in pulp fiction, there's sympathy for the villain. In The Big Sleep and other pulps of the era, there was a lot of ambiguity, and like the black and white morality of, like, say, Superman and Batman was actually pretty rare. And if you read a lot of the pulps from this era, you get the sense of bad guys aren't just mustache twirling evil people. But again, that's a different conversation for a different time. But what I'm trying to get at is that even if it has an arcadey feel, it doesn't mean that you have to have more of a simplistic narrative or overly simplistic theme. Because you can have a sympathetic antagonist and villain, rather than, again, having a purely mustache twirling villain who is always evil and just oozes badness. It's something that we often gloss over in our mythologies, just as most American people believe. If you develop a more complex narrative to the troops that you paint, isn't the worst thing in the world. Although in reality, the reason why I painted the different base coats differently for the smocks and the shirts was actually, well, I was moving and I lost track of the paint pots I was using, so by the time I had found the correct pot, it was too late. The reason why for the brighter brown for the cap and the pants is because I could only find cork brown and no German field beige to buy, and so instead I made do with what I had and not what I wanted. This is a lesson that all hobbyists should take to heart. The truth of the matter is, if you wait around for the perfect storm to blow in, it will never come. Everyone's first draft and sometimes regular process will be dealing with not having the exact set of tools that they would like to have, from paints to brushes to miniatures. So we have to make do with what we have. In all honesty, I probably have too many tools in my box to be realistically effective. Paradoxically, I have many blind spots as well. In particular, it's mainly lacking in brushes, and I could probably do with a bit more oranges and maybe greens, but oh well. At the same time, that costs money, and I really don't have the cash at the moment. Besides, limitations do force us to stretch our skills to the max. Well washes, that is often seen either as talent in a bottle or just plain old cheating, but in truth, they're another tool that often gets a bad rap from more professional painters because it's more of an uncurated way of doing things. Although I believe it's less because of the fact that they're washes and more the fact that it's just not the exact specifications for what they want. Every paint brand has a different consistency, finish, and application, and more. The other thing, especially whenever it comes to a whole perspective of using different tools, for example, it's one thing to solely paint up in a full army for yourself of months or even years. It's another thing to paint up an army while on the clock for a client. Oftentimes, a client wants an army that to be done in a relatively short amount of time because that will enable them to play with said miniatures on the tabletop, and they're less concerned about having something that could compete, like a golden demon or crystal brush. It helps to also prevent this perfectionism that says that you can't stop until it's absolutely perfect. Now onto the camouflage, which is honestly quite a bit easier than what I initially thought it was going to be. Essentially, you give splotches of different paints to be close to each other without over applying them or overlapping too much. What I mean by this is that I left the uniform's original colors shine a bit through because it actually helps to complete the effect. Then again, a sin I committed was that I didn't actually thin down my paints for this part, mainly due to the fact that I didn't want to have to apply several thin coats in the exact same places over and over and over again until opacity was achieved. Besides, sometimes thinning down your paints simply isn't necessary, and it becomes more of a stylistic decision rather than a requirement. Maybe it would have been better for me to thin down these paints and then see the results. At the same time, what's done is done, and there's always next time. Again, this part really isn't meant to win any awards. It's meant to satisfy what my client contracted me to do. Despite talking about all of these subjects, I think the most pressing thing that I was wanting to do was just paint something to the best of my ability in the time frame I was given. Perfection is overrated in most cases, and usually comes not out of explicit intent most times, but rather simply building up the skills you develop over time. I know the flaws in my work. I would rather have someone fun than dwelling on something that I cannot change, and it's just more motivation to improve in the end. Before you go, don't forget to please like, comment, and subscribe. Anyways, this is Frontiers Horizon signing off, and until next time, stay frosty.